Hello again, everyone. I'm going to do a third video on the subject of scale. It's not a video I would have done and uploaded several months ago, but now I've got the luxury of a much faster broadband speed. I'm going to do it just to indulge my own thoughts, really. The two previous videos have proved interesting to a number of people, so I'm gonna press on and really go a lot further in this one. Go off the rails quite a bit, as you'll see. So apologies if you do find this worthless, really, but it's kind of humorous, but at the same time deals with some quite serious subjects, and as you'll see, it really does obsess me, this whole question. Anyway, let's press on. So I had a comment from a viewer called Rene Butter, who I'm not sure what nationality he is, but he remarks that he grew up in a metric system, so I would imagine he's either French or Belgian, maybe. European, I would say. And he made the comment. Let's just move these figures out of the way for a minute. These are my workings from my second video. He made the comment that he had always assumed, growing up in a metric world, that 1/72nd scale was the manufacturer's attempt to represent a 6-foot soldier as a 1-inch high figure, because 6 feet, here we go, is 72 inches. Yeah, so 1 in 72 would mean that you would have a 1-inch high figure. That hadn't occurred to me, but it's opened up a whole new can of worms, because it goes back to one of my other obsessions, which is metrication, the decimal system versus imperial weights and measures and all that kind of thing. As some of you may know and may remember, the very first video I put up on my YouTube channel was a kind of a trial video, really, but I spoke on the subject of the decimalisation of the United Kingdom's currency in 1971, and our switch from pounds, shillings and pence to pounds and pennies, a decimal system of pounds and pennies, and that was kind of just an attempt to talk about an historic occurrence that had occurred in my lifetime, rather than a diatribe on the advantages or disadvantages of a decimal system. But at the same time, it did have political overtones, you might say, or undertones. They weren't intentional, but they came out when 2 years ago we had the vote on Brexit, and the whole subject suddenly became politically charged, because decimalisation happened immediately before Britain joined the European Union, and there was a kind of belief amongst a lot of people who didn't want to join the European Union that decimalisation wasn't simply a way of rationalising our currency, it was also a way of easing our transition into the EU. But anyway, so what I'm hinting at here is that I don't want to raise anyone's hackles with what I'm going to say, but there are all kinds of connotations to the kind of scales that you adopt, the kind of standards that you adopt, and the kind of compromises that you make. Okay, right. So anyway, Rene made this remark, and it hadn't occurred to me that 172 might be a product of a non-metric thought process, and that could quite easily be the case. It could just be simple coincidence that 25 millimeters corresponds to 1/72nd scale. If you take the standard height of a human being to be 180 centimeters, then 25 millimeters is exactly 1/72nd of 180 centimeters. So it's a kind of crossover ratio, really, that it works both in the metric world and in the world of imperial weights and measures. So thinking about this, because he commented on old minifigs figures, and I think I did as well in the second video, I fished out of my storage this Russian artillery piece from the Napoleonic Wars, minifigs, 25mm it was sold as. No question about that. This is back in the 1970s. And I also I got that figure here, which you've seen recently on one of my videos. It's a Crimean War figure, plastic from Strelets. Here's the box set, here's the box cover, advertised as 1/72nd scale. Now putting them side by side, let's just take the artillery piece off of this a moment and show you the figure in particular. Take a look at the figure with the ramrod, put them both together, and you can see immediately that the figure is much smaller, and the ramrod, not that it's a sort of standard length from one period to another by any means, but the ramrod on the minifigs figure is almost double the length. So absolutely no correlation there whatsoever. If you were to go by the kind of what I've been describing as the UK standard, where I did this reverse bit of arithmetic and estimated that it's taking the average height of a human being as this ridiculous figure of 150 centimeters, which is tiny. It's marginally under 5 foot tall. Then the closest to 1/72nd we got here is 1/71, and that would correspond to 20 millimeters. And from a subjective point of view, I would say that does kind of correspond to what I would consider to be a 20 millimeter figure. So I think that Strelets are following a UK based system, and minifigs I'm pretty sure did as well, although they described themselves as being 25 millimeter. I think to an American or to this USA standard, that would probably be defined as 28. Oh, sorry, it's not off the camera. Probably be defined as 28 millimeter. But the whole thing, a real fudge, very kind of arbitrary classifications there, and absolutely no way of trying to untangle what is a complete mess, really. But where I wanted to go with this this video is just to sort of put to you some questions. I don't want you to answer in the comments. Just want to think for yourself. As I've shown, neither of these two systems is satisfactory, because for both of them, they don't refer back to they don't implicitly or explicitly rather express what they are taking to be the standard height of a human being. And that leads you down the road of, you can call something 1/72nd, means absolutely nothing. Strelets call that figure 1/72nd. You have to look at it, you have to buy it, you have to measure it, you have to compare it to other ranges to even get to understand what Strelets mean by 1/72nd. It's a completely meaningless term. Equally, calling something 20mm, if Strelets had gone down the road of calling that 20mm, again, at first glance, is a perfectly rational and sensible way of measuring figures, because all I would have to do is, or what I could assume that I would be able to do, is put this figure up against the ruler, and it should be 20mm tall. It's nearer 30. So you can see there, it's 3 centimetres tall, almost exactly. And worse than that, another range that also described them as 20mm tall might be 10mm or up above that or below it. So this range here, which appears to be the more objective measurement, is equally useless, equally meaningless. So given that, what do you prefer? Do you prefer to call a figure 1/72nd, or do you prefer to call it 20mm? And what are you basing that judgment on? There isn't a convincing argument or a convincing case for one side or the other. So you might just think, what's the problem? It doesn't matter. It's such a trivial matter. It is a trivial matter. That there's no point in worrying about it, Ralph. Just get on with your life, which is more or less the advice that Nigel Darkling Aldridge gave me. I'm going to come back to that shortly, about how aesthetic values are far more important. The proportions of figures matter far more than how you objectively measure and scale them and so on. And yeah, I agree. But what happens, I'm not saying it's happening in this case, but what would happen if someone said to you that by adopting one or the other of these, a person is questioning some fundamental beliefs that you might hold? It might be contradicting a firmly held political opinion. It might be contradicting or denying the existence of your God. I know that sounds really extreme, but there are many occasions throughout history where exactly that has happened, and that is where this video is going to go off the rails a little bit later. But it's also an example of why these things have mattered over the centuries, and why partly why people obsess about it. Now, I did kind of allude to that when I was talking about how my video on decimalisation did begin to attract some politically weighted commentary after the referendum in the UK. because there were, or there might be perceived to be political overtones to the whole subject of the decimalisation of the currency. So that is one example of what I'm trying to suggest to you about why these things may matter to some people and why you have to be careful in the way you phrase some of these things for fear of giving insult or injury to someone. So to give you an example, kind of a few examples of that, going back to this whole business about Nigel recommending that I take care of my blood pressure, I did in fact have to, I had a routine NHS checkup, which are done every 4 years, I think, once you're over the age of about 60. So I attended my GP surgery the other day, and indeed my blood pressure is uncomfortably high for the nurse. So I've got to reattend tomorrow to have my blood pressure taken again, and also see the doctor in a week or so's time, because they are worried about a whole kind of gamut of measurements and tests that I have done badly in. Anyway, one of the things she did, which was coincidental to this whole matter of measuring people's scale and height and so on, was she measured my height and told me it in centimetres. I can't remember. I think I was 178. I can't remember exactly. It's gone from my mind already, because I don't think of my height in terms of centimetres. I think of it in terms of feet and inches, and I think I'm about 5'10". But I asked her, what is that in feet and inches? She had no idea. She couldn't convert it at all. Although she's not, or she isn't a particularly young person, she's grown up in a world and in a health profession where people's heights are now measured in the metric system. And let me just, for a second, excuse me a moment, just going to pause the camera for a moment. Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to get out a few of my current passport and a few of my old ones, because this again is a really kind of politically charged subject at the moment, with a lot of people, a lot of Brexiteers, very anxious to discard these kind of claret-coloured EU type passports and revert back to the good old-fashioned British passport of the old days. And equally, you've got a lot of people who are dashing, if they've got Irish grandparents, or to acquire an Irish passport, so that once we've left the EU, they'll still have a passport that will take them around the EU without any kind of hindrance. But yeah, I was talking about height. Now, you may or may not have, it may not even worry you, but you may or may not have noticed that I'm not going to show you the internal details of these, because obviously it's got sort of my data in it. But this is I think this is the first passport I ever had, issued before we joined the EU, and it's got my height in there in feet and inches. Interestingly, I've put on a little bit of height, because I was about 5'8" when I had this done. This is one I had done about, I don't know, 10 years later. Yeah, it would have been 10 years later, I suppose. And what do you think? How do you think my height is measured in this one? because it's still the same old-fashioned form. It's pre-Maastricht, so we haven't been, you know, sort of, we haven't sunk that far into the European quagmire at this point. But actually, even in this one, height is measured according to the metric system, and in this one, I've just looked it up, indeed, I was 178 centimetres, so my height hasn't changed since then, which is pretty remarkable. I would have thought I would have shrunk a little bit by now. Okay, let's take you on to this one then. What do you think my height is measured in this one? Obviously it's not going to be feet and inches, but curiously, it's not measured at all. It's not a problem what height you are now. You can go anywhere and be as short or as tall as you like. But this nurse didn't know how to equate feet and inches to centimetres. I didn't push the matter because I wasn't there for a, you know, kind of political argument with her. But something very similar happened to me a year or so ago when I was out looking for a length of teddy bear fur to use as a gaming mat for the game Congo. You may remember a video I put up on that, and I needed to get a 3 foot by 4 foot area of teddy bear fur, and I was in this haberdasher's shop, and it was a very kind of confusing situation for me because it's the first time I've ever shopped in haberdashers, and there were lots of middle-aged women in there buying all their materials and so on, and didn't understand the system at all. But what you're supposed to do was take the entire roll of the material that you wanted up to a kind of cutting desk where one of the shop assistants would ask you how much length of the material you wanted, and cut it out with a pair of scissors for you. And that was all done in metric terms. So the roll was a standard width, I can't remember how long, about 1 metre wide, and when she laid it out on the table, she had a ruler kind of embedded into the table, a bit like this, but it didn't have inches and centimetres, which surely is a sensible thing. I mean, this ruler isn't that old, and it makes sense to have both systems on it, doesn't it? All they had was centimetres. You were compelled down this road of the metric system, and I think I think this is one of the things that does gall people. It's when you're kind of obliged to adopt a system, when you haven't got a choice. You know, again, it kind of what does it matter in the real world? You know, a piece of cloth is a piece of cloth, but it's a sort of very subtle nudging down a certain road, and people kick against that. I'm sure they do. They kick against it, and I kind of made a very sort of flippant remark to this woman. I wasn't being, you know, kind of objectionable or anything, but I was just stating my predicament that I just don't think in metric terms. And she was only about, I don't know, she wasn't that much younger than me, and yet she really did, her eyes widened, and she really did look concerned that I was about to go into some kind of Europhobic kind of rant or something like that, and maybe, I don't know, she must have thought I was a bit odd anyway, because I didn't know, you know, didn't know what I was doing in the shop, and she must have wondered what I needed this material for, and maybe she thought I was there simply to make a point about metric measurements, and I was going to kind of stage some kind of demonstration. But anyway, it clearly worried her, and she was at a complete loss, even though she wasn't much younger than me, to know how to convert the figure back. And I'll tell you what the biggest irony of that story is that I was buying the mat to play Congo. I was buying it to play a game where the rules are written and published in France by Studio Tomahawk, and they have written the rules requiring the player to use a 4 foot by 3 foot playing surface. So there's just as much of a fudge on this side of the channel as there is on the other. You know, these things are blurred, just like this is blurred, that no one knows what the average height is. No one really has kind of decided that, okay, the wargaming industry in future is going to adopt 1 in something scales rather than millimetre height scales. Same thing is going on, not just in Europe, but all over the world, where we're fudging together these systems, not really understanding the ramifications of what we're doing. I mean, it's very similar in America. If I'm correct, I'm not sure if I am correct, but don't Americans drive miles per hour? I don't know. I'm not sure. There is something like that. They still drink. Do they drink pints and gallons, or I don't think America has gone totally metric. I might be wrong in that. But there are very definite political and sometimes religious engines driving these changes. It's not simply a matter of rational decision making about which is the most suitable system to use, and I'm going to go on and talk about that. Okay, now when I did that first video on the subject of decimalisation, I was talking really about partly anyway about why people would prefer to use a metric system to a non-metric one, and in particular why a lot of systems are based on 12 parts rather than 10. And one of the things that is very apparent about, so let's start with the decimal system, is that mental arithmetic is much easier when you're talking, when you're trying to work out sums in tens, and that was certainly a very prominent argument for decimalisation back in the late 60s, early 70s. Nowadays, it doesn't hold such importance because so much of our mental arithmetic is done for us. So someone in a shop who very rapidly got used to this, the mental arithmetic of being able to tell you how many pennies there were in a shilling and how much change you get out of half a crown if you spent I don't know, shilling and sixpence, or what a third of a pound was, all that kind of thing. You would learn it very quickly simply through habitual use. Much easier to tell you what 90 divided by 10 is, or something like that, but it's still, nowadays you'll find in shops, when you go in shops, most people don't, most of the cashiers and so on aren't doing any arithmetic at all. They're allowing the cash machine to tell you what change they need to give you and that kind of thing. And mental arithmetic isn't necessarily any easier in the decimal system than it is in this system. To give you another example, one of the first jobs I ever had, although you didn't know it at the time you had the interview, one of the interviewers had a set question that he used to give the interviewees, and that was, what is 70% of 7? Now, in an interview situation, or even now, it might be taking you a few seconds or even minutes to work out what that figure is. Not a sort of immediately obvious answer. Whereas the practicalities of working in a system that uses 12s is kind of infinitely superior if you're dealing in, say, a marketplace. There are far more ways of dividing 12 beans up between parties than there are dividing up 10. It's divisible by 1, obviously, 2, 3, 4, 6. Let's write this down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 8 if you allow it, so 1.5 times. Let's exclude 8, and 12. Whereas 10 is divisible by 1, 2, 5, and 10, and that's it. So six divisions are possible there, and only 4 in this system. So if you're trading in a marketplace, if you're trading commodities, that kind of thing, it makes far more sense why some of the ancient Mesopotamian cultures and so on adopted this kind of counting system. And that as well has connotations in the field of astronomy. This was the other thing that I was referring to back in this thing on decimalisation. If you are talking about a system which is trying to analyse a circular motion, or something that isn't linear, isn't straightforwardly linear, like the movement of the planets, then it is far more practical to divide this kind of thing up into segments, and you often end up with, and this is true as well if you're thinking about time, because if you're standing on the surface of the planet and the sun rises and goes over your head, it's a sort of half of a circular movement, or it's an arc at any rate, not necessarily a circle. It's far more convenient and easy to divide that up into segments of the day in a non-decimal, non-metric way, which is why we have retained things like 60 minutes in an hour, 60 seconds in a minute, that kind of thing. Now, there has been a conflict, even so, with these two systems in the field of the calendar, at least, not necessarily in timekeeping, but certainly in the calendar. And this is where we stray now into the realms of religion, and it becomes kind of, again, a sort of semi-contentious issue. Because if you go back to the pre-Christian days, the Romans had a calendar. They needed to know, well, as did all civilizations, needed to know what time of the year it was, when to sow crops, when to gather them, when to harvest, that kind of thing, when they could expect the days to begin to lengthen or shorten, all that kind of thing. But the Romans, being a kind of more systematic, kind of rational thinking kind of society. Started off with a year that only had 10 months in it, which is why the month of December, the 12th month of our year, is actually named Decem, after the Latin for 10. And as Roman society slowly developed, months were added to the year, which is why we have months that relate to the names of Roman emperors like Julius Caesar, who was actually responsible for reforming the calendar, which is why we have a calendar known as the Julian calendar. We don't have this at the moment, but why there is a calendar known as the Julian calendar. And the month of August, the 8th month of the year, which was originally October, is now August, named after the Emperor Augustus. So, what is going on here? Why the change is obviously necessary. Julius Caesar altered the calendar for practical reasons, that the Roman calendar was drifting so far away from the reality of the real world and the real seasons that reform was desperately needed. But at the same time, the importance of the calendar to ancient civilizations wasn't just about practicalities, it was also about religious worship. The planets themselves, which it's the rotation of the planets that decide our seasons, the rotation of the Earth around the Sun that decides the seasonality of the Earth. But the planets themselves were worshipped. The sun was worshipped, the moon was worshipped, and more particularly some of the pagan gods, who kind of all equate to one another. So you get a kind of correlation, say, between Zeus and Jupiter, the Greek and the Roman gods, but you also get a correlation or an identification of the planets with these pagan gods. So there is a planet that we still know to this day as Jupiter. The planet's called Neptune, Mercury, Mars, Venus. They're all linked to pagan deities. So again, you can see there a kind of there's a potential there for religious fractions, religious divides to take place, because once Christian society comes into the whole matter, you're beginning to get Christians who have retained the legacy of a pagan nomenclature of the planetary system. Going on from that again, a lot of the Christian festivals don't relate specifically to historic Christian events. They correspond right the way across the world, the Christian world, to previous pagan festivals. So Christmas is close to the winter solstice. Easter is connected to the sort of vernal equinox. Easter isn't a fixed date, even in the Christian calendar, because it's tied, the date of Easter is tied to the date of the Passover, because Jesus was crucified at the time of the Passover, and in the Judaic calendar, the Passover was variable in the solar calendar because it was based on the lunar calendar. So that is why Easter, the Passover and Easter, both change dates in our calendar. But what I'm trying to kind of demonstrate to you is that the functioning systems that we use are often an amalgam of two different kind of belief systems, or even more. They're very much a fudge and a working practical solution to a conflict of beliefs and a conflict of interests. So Christians rapidly learnt to compromise over the nomenclature of their calendar, and that happens in all kinds of fields, all sorts of measurements, right up to the current day. But some of them are more controversial than others. So, to move on from the Julian calendar, one of the massive schisms in the Christian church, obviously, was the period of the Reformation, and the split in the church between Protestants and Catholics. Now, possibly by an unfortunate coincidence, it was in the 16th century that Pope Gregory decided that it was time to reform the Julian calendar. So Pope Gregory introduced something known as the Gregorian calendar. The reason he did that was precisely because the Julian calendar contained too many leap years, and that was resulting in the seasons drifting away from the calendrical dates for notable Christian festivals such as Easter. So there was a danger that if there was the obvious, not looming, but the obvious inevitability would be that after thousands of years had drifted by, Easter was going to take place in midwinter. There was that kind of predictability about the whole system going wrong. So in 1582, Pope Gregory imposed on the Catholic world the Gregorian calendar, which I think, if I remember rightly, it's 9 days, might be 11 days. I think it's 11 days different from the Julian calendar. As you probably gathered by now from all my other videos, I do have a fascination with numbers and so on. So I just want to talk about the Gregorian calendar for a minute. As it does, again, calendars do relate to the theme of the overall theme of my channel, which is history. Because without dates taken from the calendar, you haven't got the bones and you haven't got the skeleton of history to begin with. Most of you listening are probably old enough to remember the year 2000, the turn of the millennium. What were you doing? Can you remember what you were doing on February the 29th? Did it seem a remarkable day to you? It was a remarkable date in the Gregorian calendar. And yeah, it wouldn't have seemed so to you unless you were aware of it. I said a moment ago the Julian calendar had too many leap years. So what the Gregorian calendar did was it had a leap year every 4 years. We're quite familiar with that. Every 4 years, there's a February the 29th. For the other 3 years, there's only 28 days in February. But in the Gregorian calendar, every 100 years, so at the turn of every century, there isn't a February the 29th. Even though 100 is divisible by 4, there isn't a February the 28th. So did you notice in 2000 whether or not there was a February the 29th? Did you question it? You probably didn't. And in fact, there was a February the 29th. And that's because, although every 100 years there isn't a February the 29th, every 1,000 years there is, and there is going to be. So this calendar that was worked out in the 16th century, 500 years after the year 1000, and 1.5 millennia after the birth of Christ, which is what the Christian calendar is based on. Again, very kind of religious, connotations to this, obviously. But every 1,000 years, it was determined that there would be a February the 29th. So it kind of went unnoticed, even though we lived through a very kind of significant date in the Gregorian calendar, went completely unremarked and uncelebrated, which is a bit of a shame, really. But anyway, the mathematics of dates and calendars and the way it dovetails in with days of the week fascinates me. Probably a lot of you just know now that what a weird kind of person I am. But there is a sort of, not simple, but there is a way mentally doing the arithmetic to work out from any date what the day of the week was, without having to refer to charts or anything like that. So I just wanted to show you that, because it interests me. It may interest you. It's named after an English mathematician who I think is still alive. He lives in America nowadays. He moved to America a long time ago. I've forgotten his first name, but his surname is Conway, and it's known as Conway's doomsday algorithm. And he works out that he didn't only realise, it's pretty obvious that there is a mathematical inevitability to what date will be what day of the week, but he worked out a way of calculating it. What you do is you start with a significant day or date of the year. So he took not February the 28th or the 29th, but he referred to the last day in February. Okay, so that could either be 28 or 29. And he realised that once you know the last day in February for any particular year, you can do very simple arithmetic to calculate backwards and forwards. Okay, that's pretty obvious. So couldn't tell you off the top of my head, but today is what is today? November the 7th today. I'm filming this, and it's a simple matter of counting from the 28th. If you know what day of the week February the 28th was this year, then you know what today is. Today is a Thursday. Now, there is very simple kind of mnemonic for knowing this. This year, February the 28th, was a Wednesday. Yeah, pretty sure it was. I'm just going to look that up. Yeah, it was. I was doubting myself for a minute. So, knowing that February the 28th this year was a Wednesday, immediately gives me the key to knowing what any other day this year, what day of the week it will fall on. And the way you do that is it's pretty easy to work backwards from the 28th for January and February. Okay, so you leave those out for the moment. But you have the 4th month of the year, the 6th month of the year, the 8th month of the year, the 10th month of the year, and the 12th month of the year. Okay, April, June, August, October, and December. So notice now we're, again, just to remind you, no longer a decimal system for the calendar that the Romans once endeavoured to kind of impose on people. But I know from this this algorithm that on the 4th of April, on the 6th of June, on the 8th of October, on the 8th of August, on the 10th of October, and on the 12th of December, all those days are also going to be Wednesdays. Really easy to remember it. Check it out for yourself in your diaries and calendars. Or even today's, as I said, it's Thursday the 7th of December. 7th of November. Right, hang on, yeah, got to get onto that. Right, now you got the intervening months, okay, so you have 9 and 5 and 7 and 11. September, May, July and November. And it also happens that on the 9th day of the 5th month, and on the 5th day of the 9th month, and on the 7th day of the 11th month, and the 11th day of the 7th month, they also all fall on a Wednesday. Nice and tidy, isn't it? So, as I say, today is today the 7th of November? Just going to pause the camera a minute. Yes, it is, because it's not Thursday today. I'm going nuts, aren't I? Today is Wednesday. I've just put the bins out, so I should have known that. It's Wednesday today, not Thursday. So erase everything I said about it being Thursday before. So today is the 7th of November, and it is a Wednesday. Phew. Right. Okay. So there you have it for 1 year. But how do you work out for other years? How can you work out retrospectively or in advance what day of the week the last day in February will fall? Well, as it turns out, that is also fairly relatively easy thing to do. And the way you do it is that you go back, as I was saying, to these significant years, the turn of the century. These are the years when normally you would get a leap year other than every 1,000 years. And what Conway realised was that there is a pattern in the days of the week that will occur on the turn of the centuries. So, for instance, in 1800, February the 28th was a Friday. in 1900, February the 28th was a Wednesday. Yeah. In the year 2000, February the 29th was a Tuesday. And in the year 2100, February the 28th will be a Sunday. Now, it will carry on, that sequence will carry on, or carry on backwards throughout time. It will never change. There will never be a last day in February in a year that ends 00 until the end of time, as long as we're using the Gregorian calendar, when it will fall on a Saturday or a Thursday or a Monday. It's got to be one of those 4 days, and it will always rotate in that way. So if you go back to 1700, and this is where we're going to get into some degree of difficulty in relation to but if you're talking about the Catholic world in 1700 and not the UK, you would go, that would have been a Sunday. Okay, it wasn't in Britain. I'm going to come on to that in a minute. So it goes on like that. So you've got a kind of, if you can remember that sequence, then you can remember you got a fixed day from then on, and then you can look at any particular century. Okay, so let's look, say, I'll tell you what, we're going to look at a specific date in the 20th century. So we're going to look at the 7th of December 1941. Now I picked that date because it's the day that will live in infamy, as Franklin D. Roosevelt said. It's the day that the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and most people are aware, if they know the history of it, that it happened on a Sunday. So let's show you how you work out, if you didn't know that, how you could work it out. What you do is you take the year, you remove the century, so you end up with the figure 41. You divide it by 12, which gives you 3, and you look at the remainder, which is 5, and you see how many times you can divide 5 by 4, which is 1. Okay, so you have 3 and you have 1, which is 4. So you look at Wednesday, you add 4. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I hope this works after all this. I look right idiot. Okay, so what that tells you, hopefully, is that February the 28th, the last day of February in 1941, was a Sunday. So if we go back to that previous working out, so I know that on the 12th day of December should be a Sunday. It's gone horribly wrong, isn't it? Which means that the 5th was a Sunday. Right. Back to the drawing board. Yeah, I know what it is. I know what it is. You need to take this into account as well. So you take 3, you add the remainder to it, which makes 8, and then you add how many times 4 goes into 5, which is 1. So you add 9. So you don't add 4 to Wednesday, you add 9 to Wednesday, which is the same as adding 2 to Wednesday. So we know, apologise for that, that the last day in February 1941 was a Friday. And from that, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, yeah. From that we know that the 12th of December was a Friday. Therefore the 5th of December was a Friday. Therefore the 7th of December was a Sunday. Hooray! Got there in the end. Sorry about that. Okay, and that applies to every year in the Gregorian calendar. Doesn't apply to the Julian calendar. Which is why I was saying there's an issue when you get to dates in history if you're looking at non-Catholic countries. And this is the whole point really that I was saying about people kicking back about having changes imposed on them, especially if there are political or religious connotations to that change. And the Protestant world was extremely reluctant to accept what they saw as a Catholic change to their calendar. So what you find happens throughout history is that the Protestant countries gradually adopt the Gregorian calendar because it is far more practical. The arguments over religious differences and so on don't weigh as heavily as the practical issues of having a functioning and accurate calendar. By the way, shall I go into a by the way? There is an issue here with the calendar is never, it's going to be, one calendar is going to be more accurate than another, but there is no such thing as a precisely accurate calendar, because the solar system isn't mechanically precise in its own right. So I did get a few simple props out to show this point to you when I came to it. So let's just look at these couple of lids, an old sort of Dutch. We'll be talking about the Dutch in particular in a minute. Stroopwafel tin lid and a milk bottle lid that I've marked with a little sticker. So this is going to be the sun, this is going to be the earth, not to scale obviously, not by any means, but a day on the earth is one rotation of the earth, okay, so that the relation of one spot on the earth coincides once again with its relationship with the sun. So one rotation is one day, which is approximately 24 hours. Now, days are never exactly the same. All kinds of things change them. The spin of the earth is partly controlled by the gravity of the moon, and the moon is slowly drifting away from the earth. I think it's about a centimetre a year that the moon is moving away from the earth. Now, long before humanity was around, long before there was life on Earth, the moon was so close to the Earth that it only took 8 hours for the Earth to rotate. There was only 8 hours in a day. That's a measure of how far away the moon has drifted away from us already. there are also other things that change the speed of rotation of the Earth. For instance, um, even a strong wind blowing on the Himalayas can, believe it or not, can slow the rotation of the Earth down a fraction of a second every day. So basically what I'm trying to say is that there is no such thing as a uniform standard length of day. Now, the Earth rotates around the Sun once a year. It's not a circular motion, it's an elliptical motion, but it's approximately every 365 days. It's not at all. This is why we need leap years. It's about 365 days and so many hours, which is why we need leap years in order to adjust the calendar. But at the same time, there is no guarantee. Once the Earth has got back around to the same point in relationship to the Sun, there is no guarantee, because the days are differing in length. There is no guarantee that you're going to arrive back at the same spot in terms of the relationship of the Earth and the Sun as you are from the time of day that spot on Earth married up to the Sun. So that's an extreme case, but it could be something like that. So you could get round from this doesn't happen because it's far more precise than this. But what I'm trying to do is show you an extreme example of what an inaccuracy might look like. But you could, on the 1st of December, you could be there 1 year, and the next year you come around to the 1st of December again, and the clock is off by 6 hours. That doesn't happen, don't worry. But there's a potential in an imprecise, or in an imprecise system for that to happen. Time, as measured on a calendar, is not a precise thing. Time as measured, say, by an atomic clock, where the vibrations of a particular molecule don't change in their frequency, is a far more accurate way of measuring time. But it doesn't coincide with time as measured on a calendar. So to get back to this whole thing about the Gregorian calendar being reluctantly accepted by certain people, the Protestant countries adopted the Gregorian calendar very slowly, and over the course of a number of centuries. As I say, it was first introduced in 1582. I believe it was 1928 when the Greeks, 1928, I think it was the end of the 1920s anyway, when the Greek Orthodox Church changed. A good example of that from the historian's point of view is we're all aware, or most of us are aware, that the October Revolution, which happened on October the 25th, 1917, is celebrated in Russia on November the 7th. And that's because at the time of the October Revolution, the Russians hadn't conformed to the Gregorian calendar. They were still using the Julian calendar. So the revolution happened on October the 25th, but then the Soviets introduced the Gregorian calendar, matter of secularization, and they then celebrated the actual day, the actual anniversary, rather than the date on the calendar. Now this is another curious thing that countries are beginning to conform in terms of they're all fitting into the Gregorian calendar slowly. In Britain, we adopted the calendar on, got it written down, the 14th of September 1752, which is why at that time on our calendar, on the Julian calendar that we were using in Britain, Sunday wouldn't have been the last day of February in the year 1700. It would have varied from that, and I'm not going to do the arithmetic, having demonstrated my appalling mental abilities earlier. But we're conforming with the Gregorian calendar, okay, across the world. But let's look at another October the 25th. October the 25th, 1415, St. Crispin's Day. For an Englishman, an important day, the Battle of Agincourt, Henry V, Shakespeare's speech, all that kind of thing. Agincourt was fought on St. Crispin's Day according to the Julian calendar, but we still celebrate it on St. Crispin's Day, but according to the Gregorian calendar. We are following a different what's the word? A different standard, almost, as it were, a different way of complying than the Russians do, because the Russians literally take the annual anniversary, so they're going by each year that has passed since October the 25th, and they're kind of ignoring the fact that the calendar has meant that they have lost 11 days, whereas the British are taking the literal date. Is it any relevance? I don't know, that it's a religious holiday, a Saint's Day. But anyway, we haven't adopted that same adjustment. We have literally transposed the date from one calendar to another. So if you celebrate the Battle of Agincourt on October the 25th, you're actually out by 11 days of celebrating the anniversary. Another weird. It's all fudge. It's all a mess. It's just as much of a mess as those figure scales that started me off on this whole track. November the 5th, which we just celebrated here again in the UK, 1605, opening of Parliament. Guy Fawkes tried to blow Parliament up and kill the King and the government, failed, and ever since we have celebrated Guy Fawkes Night. Now again, this is another case where it did happen on November the 5th on the Julian calendar, and we celebrate it on November the 5th on the Gregorian calendar. So you might think, yeah, right, there's a compliance here, there's a conformity, that we have decided that all the dates that happened on the Julian calendar, we'll simply pretend that switch didn't matter. But what happens in other cases? Let's take November the 5th again. November the 5th, 1688. Not such a notable date, but I'll tell you what happened on that day. That is the day that William of Orange landed in Brixham, down here in Devon, to begin the Glorious Revolution. Okay, Fair enough, you might think. Not a particularly notable date for many people. But the problem that William of Orange had was that he actually left the Netherlands on November the 11th. What's that? 6 days later. It took him a while to get across the up the channel and land at Brixham, but he actually left after he arrived, according to the calendar. And the reason for that is that the Netherlands had already, by this stage, adopted the Julian calendar, whereas the British hadn't. So he becomes co-regent of Britain with his wife, Queen Mary, and he's ruling over two countries that are operating on different calendars. So he's got a big problem, and that manifests itself now in another anniversary, which is really politically supercharged, which is the Battle of the Boyne. I suppose you'd call it Orange Day, for reasons that I'll make clear in a moment, which is celebrated on the 12th of July each year. Now, people imagine that they're celebrating the Battle of the Boyne, but they're not. The Battle of the Boyne actually took place, I've got it written down here, on the 1st of July 1690. The battle that is celebrated is actually the Battle of Angrim, which took place on the 11th of July. But there is here, although the Orange Order and so on in Belfast think they are celebrating the Battle of the Boyne, they're not. They're celebrating the Battle of the Boyne were you going by the Julian calendar. So we don't, here in the UK, we don't necessarily follow this this rule of thumb of adopting the Gregorian calendar, simply transposing the date all the time. Again, it's a complete mismatch of things. So I want to sort of go back to days of the week now, and these themes of paganism versus Christianity and Protestantism versus Catholicism and so on, and talk about the days of the week. Right, this may seem blindingly trivial to everyone, I know, but there is something that really fascinates me that comes out in this. So I'm going to write down the days of the week. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Now, it's always struck me as being a little bit odd that we're in a ostensibly kind of a Christian society. Certainly we were up until several hundred years ago, but we name so many days of the week after pagan gods or after planets which are in themselves named after pagan gods. So you have Saturn for Saturday, Frey for Friday, Thor for Thursday, Woden for Wednesday, I think it's T-U-W for Tuesday, and it's only Sunday and Monday that are named after the sun and the moon, but all the same, not named after Christian saints or God or something like that. they're all named after planetary systems or pagan gods, or a combination of the two. If you go to the continent, that's different, or at least it is in the more traditionally Catholic countries such as France, Italy and Spain. So I won't write them all down, but let's write this. So this is Britain, but let's write France down here. Let's give you an example of France. You got dimanche, excuse my French accent, lundi, mardi, mercredi, jeudi, vendredi and samedi. Now, I'm not saying these are religious, Christian religious nomenclature, but they do differ, they do diverge from Britain, from the Protestant countries. France, Italy and Spain all have very similar terms or names for their days of the week, but they are also, if you notice, Moon Day, La Lune, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter or Jove, Venus and Saturday again, Saturn again. I think that's Saturn, actually that might be the Sabbath, I'm not sure. Not so sure on that one. And that conforms across France, Italy and Spain in particular. Now, there is a divergence there. I'm not quite sure why they have retained the kind of Roman pagan gods, other than possibly it's a legacy of the Roman religion filtering down to the Roman Catholic Church. Whereas here in Britain, but this happened even before Britain became a Protestant country. So this is while Britain was. There's a very kind of obvious kind of cultural difference between Britain and much of the rest of the continent. Can you see where I'm going here? I'm sort of heading back towards cultural kind of ties to the continent and differences with the continent that have just really come into focus again over arguments over Brexit in recent years. But Germany, if you go to Germany, which is another, what I think you probably fair to call a Protestant country nowadays. I mean, it's obviously a mix of Catholic and Protestant nations. But Germany have a very similar kind of names for days of the week as we do. They have, I'll write these down, they have Sonntag, so Sunday, literally, Montag, Moon Day, Monday, again, literally exactly the same as Britain and the Catholic countries. But then they have Dienstag. I don't speak German, so you'll have to excuse my... which is derived from a German god, I think it's called Thinsus, I wrote down, who is related to Tew. So they are naming their second or third day of the week after the same god that we do, the same pagan god that we do, Tuesday. And I didn't mention at the time, but these two, the god Tew, the closest equivalent in Roman mythology would be the god Mars. So we are all converging, we have all converged on the same consensus of what the significance of each day of the week is in terms of both Christian and pagan religions here. So we have come to, and I don't, as far as I know, there wasn't some kind of vast conference in the middle of Europe in the year whatever. This is all kind of blended together and emerged as a kind of consensus just from, you know, sort of working habits and into relationships and so on. Anyway, Wednesday, Germans are a bit boring in this case because they call it Mittwoch, which just means middle of the week. But then you get back to Thursday is Donnerstag. Now Donner, thunder and lightning, remember? Donner, thunder, god of thunder, Jove, Thor. So again, complete correlation there. Freytag, very obvious, same god, Frey, Friday. God Frey, female god, as was Venus, same kind of parallel god in the two different kind of religious spheres. And then Samstag, again, I'll refrain from commenting on that, but I think a lot of these are to do with the day of the Sabbath rather than Saturn. I think there's just a coincidence of the names S and A there, so that might be where we are slightly different here in the UK. So that just is interesting, I think, if you find it interesting, I do. But let me now show you something that I find absolutely remarkable. So let's write down the days of the week again. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Now, how far away from Europe would you expect this kind of compliance to go? And remember, this all started with me talking about miniature wargame figures scales, and how compliance and conformity and cooperation evolve out of complexity. Do you remember that Axelrod book? So we got the 7 days of the week here again, and I'm going to take you to Japan and write down the names of the Japanese days of the week. Okay, so you got Nichiyobi, Getsuyobi, Kayobi, Suiyobi, Mokuyobi, Kinyobi and Doyobi. And again, excuse my Japanese pronunciations there. Nichiyobi. Yobi just means day. Nichi is Japanese for sun. Getsu is Japanese for moon. Now, that's it as far as planets go. But Kayobi is named after an element, the element of fire. Suiyobi is named after the element of water. Mokuyobi is named after the element of wood. Kinyobi after gold or metal. And Doyobi after earth. Okay, so at first glance, no further link other than the sun and the moon being equivalent to Sunday and Monday in Japanese as well. Bit of a strange. Why should that be? They're on the other side of the globe. These names go back to antiquity. You know, why did that spring up? It's more than just coincidence. Now let's look at the planets which we were looking at before. What is the Japanese for the equivalent on Tuesday? You've got Mars here, and Mars is a planet. What is the equivalent Japanese name for Mars? Well, you probably guessed. It's Kasei. It's the fire planet, and Mars is the fire planet. What is the Japanese for Mercury? It's Suisei, the water star, or the water planet. It's getting spooky, isn't it? What is the Japanese for Jupiter? Mokusei, the wood star. It's a planet that's named after the element wood, as is the same day of the week, Thursday, named after wood. What is the Japanese for Venus, the planet Venus? Kinsei, the gold or metal star, metal planet. And Saturday is Dosei, which is the Earth. It's named after the Earth, so it's the Earth's day, which I think, you know, does this link all the way back to the Sabbath? Is there some kind of link there? I don't know, but that is beyond coincidence. And what I immediately wanted to kind of nip in the bud is any kind of conspiracy theory sort of reasoning going on here. Probably the reason this has happened is that we both civilizations, the East, the Orient, and the West. So China and Japan and the West derive their early belief systems and thought systems in planetary movements and the calendar and so on from India. So the thinking, the spread has spread through Buddhism from India through to China and Japan, and it's spread in the opposite direction into the West, through the kind of Middle East and the Magi and astronomical observers of the planets and the stars and so on, moving kind of westwards as well as eastwards, and that's the reason it's happened. But it's a really good example, I think, about how systems can and do slowly merge and slowly bend together, and the outcome, I can't tell you what the outcomes can be, because it could take centuries for this to happen, but you can see a similar thing happening with the adoption of metric systems in our own day. That you got that jumbling of America using some metric and some imperial measures, just as we now do in Britain. We're dropping some things like pints and getting more used to speaking in litres, but there are engines that are going underneath. I've neglected to mention a kind of constant theme of competition and conflict between Britain and France over the years, and there was a very definite kind of attempt in France, especially from the time of the Revolution onwards, to secularize and to become metric, and they even attempted to do that with the calendar. They did reintroduce a metric calendar at one point where there were 10 days in a week and so on. It proved very unpopular, and was dropped after about 4 years. But that is the kind of an extreme, that is the sort of extreme rational thought process that the British have kind of kicked back against because it's far more in the British influence to be the standard setter rather than the standard receiver. It's just the same as whether we want to be a rule maker or a rule taker argument nowadays over Brexit. Back in the 18th century, Britain wanted to be the centre of where scientific standards were set, which is why places like the Greenwich Observatory and Greenwich Mean Time and measuring time and date from the Greenwich Meridian was important to us and is still very culturally significant to us. Whereas in France you have the academies and that is the sort of the centre of the universe as far as the metric system goes, and that is why there is a kind of as well as there being rational arguments for favouring one side or another, there is a really deep-seated cultural, political and religious basis for resisting the change. And it's the whole reason why we, in the last couple of 100 years you have all this confusion over dates being different in one country to another and so on, and why people like me sort of still get hot under the collar over whether you're going to measure a piece of cloth in feet and inches or centimetres. And as Nigel quite rightly says, I really should look after my blood pressure, but I go to my doctors to get my blood pressure checked. They're measuring it in millimetres of mercury. I mean, a typical blood pressure, I think the average is meant to be 120 over 80. What does that represent? It's 120 millimetres of mercury over 80 millimetres of mercury on that sphygmomanometer that we might remember seeing. Mercury, completely and absolutely a rational choice for an element that can be used as a sort of measuring system. Doesn't need to ever be calibrated or anything. Doesn't change very much with heat and temperature and so on. So it's a really consistent element to use as the basis for measuring a pressure. But they have done ever since I've never known blood pressure to be measured in inches and fractions of an inch. It's always been measured using the metric system. So even the fact that this issue raises my blood pressure, and I then go to get my blood pressure measured, it raises my blood pressure again. Just wanting to know why, and what's the thought processes behind the calibrations that I just live with, and we all live with from day to day, and day to days themselves named after different belief systems, but all beginning to conform. It just goes on and on. Anyway, that's enough of a waffle again. That's going to be a really long video this time, and it's probably a bad thing that I can put these things up now without too much effort. But thanks very much everyone again for listening. Bye for now.